My name is Grace Cordial. I'm the manager of the Beaufort District Collection, the Beaufort County Library's Special Local History Collection and Archives Unit. Today I will use some of the rare and unique materials we take care of in the Beaufort District Collection to explain what happened here in Beaufort County, South Carolina during the biggest disaster in its history. It's a tale seldom told outside our state. I concur with Clara Barton that the descriptions of this fearful catastrophe I shall leave to the reports of those who saw, shared its dangers, and lived within its tide of death. Thus, I will share personal accounts, newspaper articles, and government records, as together we explore the history and consequences of the Great Sea Island hurricane that devastated Beaufort County in 1893. Until quite recently, it's safe to say that many local residents and real estate agents held the opinion that somehow Beaufort County, South Carolina was a protected place, that somehow Beaufort County had been bypassed by extreme weather. Evidence points to a different conclusion. The Historical Hurricane Tracks website indicates that almost 150 hurricanes and tropical storms have struck within 60 nautical miles of Beaufort County since 1852. Let's peer back to see what life was like in 1890's Beaufort County before the biggest, baddest storm in our local history struck. When the hurricane of 1893 came ashore, it hit a radically different Beaufort County than the one we live in now. The county was geographically larger. Beaufort County was the land and water wedged between the Savannah and Combahee rivers from the Atlantic Ocean to the Charleston and Savannah Railroad track that more or less parallels present-day I-95 through Jasper County. The county was far less populated. The population of the entire county was about 35,000 people. That's less than the approximate population on Hilton Head Island alone today. The demographic of the population was starkly different as well. At the time of the Great Sea Island hurricane, Beaufort County was over 90% black. Most of the resident population lived on subsistence farms, supplemented by bounty from the marshes, rivers, and sea. In 1893, Port Royal and St. Helena Sounds were very busy with maritime trade. The major source of employment was phosphate mining. Indeed, 60% of the phosphate produced in the United States came from South Carolina, and half of that was mined in Beaufort County. Black Sea Island employees who worked in the industry made good wages for the day, $1 to $2. They also made up the bulk of the labor force. As Dr. Rowland writes, things were looking up for this area. There had been no major storms in 20 years, and the economy was cruising along nicely. He says, they had no way of predicting that Beaufort County would be struck by 5 major hurricanes in 10 years, or that the first would be the worst. As things turned out, the 1890s were a tough decade for hurricanes. 4 major hurricanes struck Georgia northward that decade. August 1893 was particularly busy. On August 22, 1893, there were four hurricanes active at the same time, the first time that happened in recorded history. It's only happened once more since. One of those 4 hurricanes is shown as hurricane number 6 on this map. It was a long-lived hurricane, active for 19 days, beginning on August the 15th. Naming hurricanes didn't come into practice until the 1950s. Newspapers of the day referred to the event and its aftermath as the Sea Island Cyclone, or the Sea Island Storm, or the Great Sea Island Hurricane. Any of those names indicate the same catastrophic event. The Sea Island hurricane wreaked havoc across a good part of America, causing damage even into Canada before it dissipated on September 2, 1893. So great was the loss of life and devastation that Dr. Rowland and Dr. Wise wrote in Volume 3 The Great Sea Island hurricane wrought upon this area a revolution nearly as great as that of the American Civil War and Reconstruction. Reports from arriving ships indicated that there was a storm in the Atlantic getting closer to shore. State authorities had telegraphed around midnight on Saturday, August 26, that a storm might hit South Carolina coast somewhere on Sunday. But where? And how bad would it be? Communication with the islands was difficult. There were few bridges, and the population was spread out. In other words, Beaufort County residents could do little to get out of the way or prepare for the oncoming tempest. The bare-bones history of the storm is captured in the historical marker put up at Penn Center in 2008 by the Beaufort County Historical Society. The worst devastation happened here because Beaufort County was in the northeast quadrant at landfall. There was a 12-foot tide and 120-mile-per-hour winds. 2,000 people or more died, while 70,000 people were left destitute across the coastal plain. Why was this particular storm so deadly? A number of factors play into what happens during a storm event. Each factor can affect the power of the hurricane and the destruction it will cause. Obviously, there is wind speed. The higher the wind speed, the more likely the damage. The direction of the wind is important. Surge is primarily caused by a storm's winds pushing water onshore over and above the predicted astronomical tide. If the wind is from the west, the storm winds may minimize the storm surge. If it's coming from the east, it may maximize the storm surge. And how much water comes ashore depends on the tide stage. Will the hurricane strike at the lower low tide or the higher high tide? Sources agree that there was a 12-foot storm surge during the Sea Island hurricanes, which means that a lot of Beaufort County went and stayed underwater. And we know that storm surge and inundation tend to increase the number of casualties. Bill and Fran Marsher's excellent The Great Sea Island Storm put it simply. The hurricane hit the state's coast in the worst possible place, the flat, remote sea islands, and it hit at the worst possible time, near the end of harvest season, on high tide. Its violence was most ruthless against the nation's most vulnerable citizens, the Gullahs. Firm casualty counts were elusive from the beginning. Bodies washed up with the tides. Admiral Lester Beardsley, commander at Paris Island, reported to the Red Cross that bodies were found by following the buzzards and buried where we found them. F.W. Averill, general freight and passenger agent for the Charleston and Savannah Railroad, told the Savannah Morning News that he saw 34 dead bodies along the tracks on his way in, with many of the dead so far advanced in putrefaction that the sight was sickening and revolting. South Carolina did not require registrations of death in 1893. We must rely on newspaper obituaries, personal accounts, and coroner's inquest instead. Unfortunately, only partial records of the Beaufort County coroner's inquisitions have survived. We have some for northern Beaufort County, but none at all for southern Beaufort County. To put the crush of deaths into perspective, on average, the Beaufort County coroner handled 5 to 10 deaths per month, or approximately 100 to 120 deaths per year in the 1890s. What we do know is that in the last 3 days of August 1893, coroner's juries determined the cause of death for almost 300 people. That's the equivalent of 3 years' worth of inquests in 72 hours. And that's without any surviving inquest records for southern Beaufort County. Let that figure sink in. 3 years' worth of inquests over the course of 3 days. To call the deaths and destruction overwhelming is an understatement. Understandably, all was in chaos. Unsurprisingly, the numbers of dead seldom match up exactly across sources. Unfortunately, records are incomplete. For example, at Pacific Works, a phosphate company out on Chisholm Island, one newspaper says that 26 people died, while another newspaper reported that at least 79 bodies were buried on that plantation. The surviving Beaufort County coroner's records include an inquest for 26 people at Pacific Works. Was it 26 or 79 or some number in between, or perhaps even more? The actual figure is uncertain. Nor can I tell whether or not the 150 dead listed on the Savannah River plantations includes Hilton Head Island and Bluffton deaths. You'll also see that the town of Beaufort is listed as having 2 deaths. Those 2 deaths were Thomas and Kate Osler, an elderly African-American couple who drowned wading through the streets trying to make it to higher ground in the town of Beaufort. There is corroborating evidence for their cause of death in the coroner's inquest and a personal account that you will hear soon to confirm their identity and their deaths. Some reports also add in the pregnant wife of local attorney Thomas Talbert to the list of Beaufort town's dead. The Charleston newspaper includes Josephine Talbert as one of the 3 white people who died during the hurricane. She purportedly died from fright at the height of the storm while delivering a son, but there isn't a surviving inquest record for her. There is, however, corroborating evidence for the deaths of Dr. Hazel and for Engineer Hand of the Tug Kennedy and other sources. You'll hear more about these men a bit later, too. All the other recorded deaths were from African Americans. You can see the list of the known dead I compiled from surviving coroner's records in the BDC's WordPress blog. At best, it's 1/3 of the names of all who died in Beaufort County, because the final estimate of the number of dead ranges from 1 to 2,000 people across the Lowcountry. The inquests are difficult to read for 2 reasons. The script is often faint and hard to decipher, and the depth of personal human tragedy is hard to absorb. Ladies and gentlemen, the stories you are about to hear are true. I'm going to begin by reading testimony given by a father mourning the loss of his family the day after the storm. H.J. Middleton swore, "I live in Land's End, Beaufort County. On the night of August 27th, 1893, we were visited by a cyclone and tidal wave. Deceased are my wife and children. The wind blew a gale. We were all right at that time, but as soon as I saw the water get near the house, we made for a tree with the children. But the waves were so great and the tide was so strong that we could not help ourselves. I had 2 of the children under my arms. I found the water getting too deep and worse. I was compelled to turn them loose. I found the children and all on the next evening. If I had not turned them loose, I would have drowned myself." In a different case, Rhino White says, "I was in the house when the tide came in it. Renty Capers and his wife were there turning around looking for a shirt and other things when the chimney fell. And in a short time after that, the house fell down. The water was very high. We all floated, and I held on to sugar cane and cotton stalks until the tide fell, or I would have drowned also." There are almost 200 similar accounts in the coroner's inquest records. Indeed, death by drowning was the most reported cause of death at those inquests. Drowning was a particularly troubling way to die for Gullah people, because in Gullah tradition, a drowned person's soul is a soul in limbo. A drowned soul could find no peace in the afterlife. When Joel Chandler Harris of Uncle Remus fame was here writing an article for Scribner's magazine about 6 months after the storm, he asked an old black man, "Were many lives lost around here?" The man closed his eyes, shook his head, and replied, "We no count them. They are gone." Earlier I mentioned that one of the white men who died was Dr. Hazel. Dr. Gowan Hazel was a much beloved physician who lived out on Parris Island and worked at the quarantine station. The inquest determined that he drowned. But we know much more about the circumstances of his death because of multiple personal accounts in the historical record. In the storm-swept coast, Charlotte Edwards reported to Mrs. Mather about events on Parris Island that fateful night. That evening, the tide came up high on Parris Island. It covered the piazza and was 3 feet deep in the house. About midnight, the house shook violently and it was blown off the blocks, and the boards fell off. Many people gathered around us, coming through water up to their waists. The stairs fell on a neighbor's neck and killed her. In the morning, we could find no pigs nor poultry. At our back door lay good Dr. Hazel, who perished trying to save 2 colored boys. 19 men lay in a boat, all drowned. Nearly half the people on Parris Island perished that awful night, among whom nearly all were my relatives. Many saved their lives by climbing trees. One lady was found dead, holding on to a fallen tree. Listen to Dr. Hazel's sister's diary entry for Tuesday, August the 29th. She's the white-haired lady in this photograph taken around 1900. Bright and warm. About 3 o'clock yesterday, I got a note from Dr. Stewart saying my own brother was drowned. I cannot believe it and cannot bear it if it is true. Mr. Holmes went down in a rowboat and brought his remains, getting home about 1 o'clock this morning. He does not look natural, but it is a small comfort to be able to look upon his poor, discolored face once more. But to think I never shall hear him speak again is too much for me to bear. We buried him at 11 o'clock. In 1959, Mabel Byrne recalled the funeral of Dr. Hazel. There was much difficulty in getting the body to the Baptist cemetery, as streets were piled high with debris. But by many windings and sending men ahead with axes to cut debris of trees and etc., the hearse finally made its way, and he was buried. Many Beaufort County residents lived in small, rudely constructed wooded houses that the wind and waves destroyed. Therefore, it's not at all surprising that being crushed to death was the second most common cause of death in the coroner's Inquisition records. 2 witnesses testified at the inquest over the body of Sarah Mangian. Peggy Cummings said, "I live in the house that fell on the night of August 27th. When the house commenced to fall, all I could do was to jump through the window. I saved myself, and that was all that I could do at the time." A neighbor swore, "I live in the same plantation. I heard of the house falling. I went as soon as I could, and some others pried the house off the children. We found Sarah Mangian dead." Many residences were severely damaged. Social conventions of the time were cast aside. According to Mabel Byrne, who was 17 years old in 1893, around 1 o'clock there was a furious ringing on our doorbell, and a tall Negro man we knew asked if he might bring women and children to our front porch, as all their houses were gone. But our porch was about to fall off, so my father said, "Bring them into the house." About 30 black refugees ended up spending the rest of the night in the Burns family's private schoolroom. Byrne continued, "They had lost everything they possessed except for what was on their backs." The bodies of Thomas and Kate Osler I mentioned earlier were discovered washed up against the Burns house the next morning. Physical destruction was widespread. Byrne recalled the waves of the sea dashed against houses, and on the point where we were living, all small houses were washed away. Not one was left standing when morning came. Susan Hazel Rice describes what happened when the tide of death struck her house at 509 North Street on the Point on Sunday, August 27th this way. The wind blew all night and is still blowing, as I fear we may get the gale yet. About 4 o'clock the wind rose, and at bedtime it was a gale. The tide was 2 feet deep in our lower story, and plastering falling and rain beating in everything. Her entry the next morning was, "What a gale we had all night. Every room soaking wet, sashes blowing in, and Mr. W. and Lewis were all night nailing doors and sashes. We all lay on pallets in the sitting room but got no sleep until 4 a.m. When daylight came, what a scene of desolation. The tin is completely taken off our shed room, and the blinds blown off and sashes broken. Not a dry room in the house, and the lower story in dreadful condition. But we are better off than many others. My cow was drowned, and most of the chickens. Can't make fire in our stove as the chimney is broken in, and the stove is full of salt water. Our cistern is ruined." The waterfront in Beaufort was a shambles. Virtually every merchant experienced severe economic losses. Captain Christensen had serious damage at his house. His barn had blown down and all the cattle were killed. His favorite horse drowned. The hardware store stock was flooded 2 feet deep. He lost 200 rose bushes and 6 fig trees during the storm. His estimated losses were $10,000, the equivalent of over $263,000 today, a massive sum in 1893. Waterhouse and Ricker lost their wharf, warehouse, and cotton ginnery on the riverside of Bay Street. Local businessman F.W. Shepper lost his warehouse too. He put a brave face on the tragedy. He told the Charleston News and Courier a few days after the storm, "Well, I put that big warehouse in the wrong place. If I had known this storm was coming, I would not have done that. It took me about 15 years to make what I have lost, but I am better off in experience, and in 10 years, I will make it again. I don't see anything to despair about." Cleaning up all the mess took time. Byrne wrote that for weeks, fires were kept burning in the streets and dead bodies of dogs, chickens, and other animals were flung in and burned, for they could not be buried. We don't know what the local Palmetto Post wrote about the storm, because there are no surviving issues for most of 1893. However, the Savannah Morning News covered the situation throughout the coastal empire and South Carolina low country, stating a 50% loss in crops and housing, unnumbered dead, and starvation for the living. The Sun estimated that 80% of the houses were gone. Headlines in this Charleston newspaper included, "Coroner's gruesome task, over $1 million lost, 4,000 at St. Helena hungry." There was considerable damage at the sea too. It's hard for us to visualize just how busy the Sounds were with regular steamship service and coastal boat traffic. News of the wreck of the city of Savannah hit the Savannah paper on August the 31st. The city of Savannah had been on its way from Boston to Savannah when it ran into the storm. The vessel was pounded to smithereens offshore, eventually getting stuck about 3 miles northeast of St. Helena Island. Passenger John McDonald wrote that all aboard were without food or water and hourly expecting death. On the third night, when all hope had died out, in the darkness shot up a bright signal light, the last one we had on board. And in a few moments, another light shot out into the sky about 2 miles away. Our cry for help was answered. Women and children were rescued first and taken ashore to the Hunting Island Lighthouse on Tuesday, August 29th. 41 men were left stranded on the vessel for another night until the City of Birmingham steamer got the men off on Wednesday. John McDonald would end up being the Red Cross's field agent for Hilton Head Island, where he found love with Ida Battelle, a nurse who would become his wife. At least one other person cheated death that night. Joel Chandler Harris and Rachel Mather relate a similar story. A plucky boy had to let go of the rigging of a capsized dredge after 36 hours of holding on for dear life. Exhausted, he sank into the water, eventually floating the 20 miles to Beaufort, where he landed on a knoll but a few rods from his mother's house, where he was found and, strange to say, restored to life. An article in the Charleston News and Courier identified the boy as Arthur Wilson, age 12, of the Kennedy. Engineer Han, one of those 3 white people in Beaufort County who lost their lives during the storm, was also on the tug Kennedy. Damage to infrastructure and shipping were severe. The Morning News gave a listing of sunken or aground vessels: Clara McGilvey, Regato; Alma Cummings, W.H. Sumner, the tugs, Reliance, Juno, Weymouth, Kinkora, Kent, Stono, Dove, Ida, and Ivanhoe. And the steamers, Pilot Boy and Alpha. There were many others. Down in Bluffton, it took 3 days to dig out the steamboat Alpha from the pluff mud, where Captain Ed Daniels had intentionally beached her. As soon as there was light enough to see, everyone understood that the situation was desperate. A local relief committee immediately got to work, but circumstances quickly grew too much for them to handle. Nevertheless, Rachel Mather believed that their hearts were in the right place. She called the local committee wise and kind men who were, and ever, on the alert to encourage the desperate people thronging into Beaufort town in search of food and shelter. The Beaufort Relief Committee was an integrated committee consisting of 5 white men and 2 black men. George Holmes, the mayor, was the man who brought Dr. Hazel's body from Paris Island. Holmes had married one of Dr. Hazel's nieces. Robert Smalls, the former enslaved person who piloted the Planter into the Union lines during the Civil War, was the port collector in 1893. Mr. Lockwood was head of the Beaufort Bank. Captain Christensen and Mr. Walsh were Bay Street merchants. E.F. Convancier worked for the railroad. George Ford, a black man, was superintendent of the National Cemetery. You'll hear more about the Bluffton and Yamasee Relief Committees a bit later, but for now I'm going to discuss the committee in Beaufort. Since then, as now, Beaufort was the county seat, and at that point it had the largest population in the county, about 3,500 people pre-storm. The Beaufort Relief Committee needed help and appealed for aid from anyone willing to assist. 2,500 loaves of bread, 25 pounds of corned beef, 100 boxes of soda crackers, 50 barrels of grits, and 5 barrels of molasses soon arrived via the Port Royal Railroad. Former Congressman William Elliott went to Washington to ask for a military medical ship to help treat the injured and ill. Congressman M.C. Butler worked his contacts too. Abby Holmes Christensen sent down 10 barrels of clothes from Boston to clothe those who had none left. Merchant George Waterhouse bought $500 worth of grits with his own money to give away to the most desperate and made appeals to his business contacts for extensions of credit to Beaufort residents and business interests, as did J.J. Dale and D.C. Wilson. Many descendants of the antebellum planters sent money and supplies to Beaufort to help. Yet it was not enough. The local committee telegraphed Columbia for help. Governor Ben Tillman had no love for what he called Black Beaufort, but he took actions to assess the situation. He sent Dr. James Babcock, superintendent of the state hospital in Columbia, down to investigate. On September 4th, Dr. Babcock reported to Governor Tillman that previous reports from Beaufort have not been exaggerated. He confirmed the extreme loss of life and property, the widespread destruction of shelter, and the ruined fields. He told the governor that bodies were being buried only 2 feet deep because the soil was too waterlogged to go down any deeper. Babcock's report convinced the governor that extraordinary actions were needed. Believing that methodical and business management and experience were better, Governor Tillman asked Clara Barton for help. Clara Barton had been in Beaufort and Hilton Head Island during the Civil War as a middle-aged woman. She was now age 72, quite old in the 19th century to be undertaking a disaster recovery relief effort. Nevertheless, she and her staff arrived in Beaufort on September 20th to assess the situation. A few days later, a group of 4 middle-aged black men who had been Union soldiers during the assault on Fort Wagner came to meet her. One of the men recounted, "I was with Colonel Shaw and crawled out of the fort with a wound on the arm and a broken leg. We all got to you, Miss Clare, and now you've got to us." She conferred with the local relief committee, whom she termed perplexed by all the destitute who thronged to the county seat hoping to be fed. They became the Red Cross's advisory committee. Barton formally began the Red Cross's first hurricane relief effort on October 1st. The next day, she closed down every food and clothing storehouse in Beaufort and told everyone to go home. She announced that in future, distributions would be made to the islands with receipt for goods received. Within 3 days, Beaufort town was empty of all but its own residents. According to her nephew, it was a massive effort commenced under circumstances so new, so unexpected, so unprepared, and so adverse that much of it was simply improvised. Because the Sea Island hurricane hit just before the harvest of 1893, there was little food to tide folks over the fall, winter, and spring. The wells had been tainted with seawater. Malaria was rampant. Barton found sick, sleep-deprived, hungry, naked people who had only water from brackish wells to drink, no food, and no shelter when the Red Cross began to work in early October. Barton was media savvy for her day and time. She appealed for help in a letter sent to the nation's newspapers. There are 30,000 Americans who must be almost entirely supported by charity until they get a spring crop in April or May. Unless they are furnished with food, they will starve. Without bedding, they will die from exposure. Without medicines, of fever. Everything not perishable is needed, especially money to buy lumber, nails, bricks, and hardware to rebuild houses, cast-off worn clothing, cooking utensils, pots, pans, spoons, etc. The nation responded. Barton set up relief agents throughout the area, such as the City of Savannah survivor John McDonald. The Pilot Boy and the Alpha, now repaired, became supply boats for the Red Cross relief effort. Pilot Boy went back and forth to Charleston. Alpha went back and forth to Savannah. Both picked up food, clothing, tools, medicine, and other supplies to distribute. Here, the committee of 43 men from St. Helena and Ladies Islands pick up 2 weeks' worth of rations to distribute. That's 1,400 bushels of grits in the background. Ration size depended on whether or not the family contained able-bodied workers and whether those people worked. Each family of 7 got 8 quarts of grits and a pound of pork weekly. The sick got a small portion of tea or coffee, sugar, and bread. We know from John McDonald that supplies arrived every Friday on Hilton Head, where 30 to 40 carts would be waiting at the boat landing. Supplies were transshipped to the inhabited southern Beaufort County Islands and Bluffton from there. As mentioned in Barton's letter to the nation, the 1893 harvest was ruined. Winter gardens needed planting if people were to have food. J.C. Vaughan Seed Store of New York and Chicago sent a large supply of Irish potatoes and other seeds directly to McDonald on Hilton Head Island. At first, the Gullahs ate the seed Irish potatoes because they were hungry, but they quickly learned how to cut the eyes out and planted those. By the end of the relief efforts, Barton tallied a contribution of 1,000 bushels of seed Irish potatoes and 1,000 bushels of seed corn. In all, 5 tons of seeds were distributed to the destitute Sea Islanders. By the time of Governor Tillman's annual State of the State address in late November 1893, the Red Cross had been working about 7 weeks and was already making a difference. He stated, "The 27th of August last witnessed the most disastrous storm and tidal wave on the coast from Beaufort to Charleston of which our annals have any record." He mentioned over 1,000 people dead and a total loss of crops all the way from John's Island to Hilton Head. He reckoned that half of the houses were blown down or washed away. He stated that without the timely assistance and charity rendered thus far, lots more people would have starved. The tide of death had swept away tools, too. Tools needed to farm and fish. The Red Cross issued tools to dig drainage ditches and build houses. By the end of the relief effort, 245 miles of ditches and canals had been dug in the area between Savannah and Charleston to drain the stinky and tainted standing water. These ditches helped save some of the crops from drowning in the unusually wet spring of 1894. Rebuilding was an ongoing process. 1 million feet of lumber was shipped down the Combahee River and distributed to men who had to build or repair his own house with the lumber. Some young men, like Jack Snipes and his friends, banded together to help out the aunties, maiden or widowed women or female relatives who could not perform the repairs themselves. Pay was 50 cents per day in kind for their labor. There was an added incentive. Men who dug ditches or built houses earned double rations for their families, 2 pecks of grits, 2 pounds of pork for a family of 7. By the end of the relief effort, Barton reported thousands of houses repaired or constructed. Barton was proudest of the sewing circles who made and repaired clothing for the destitute. She applauded these women for their tireless, faithful work of self-help and mutual help across racial and socioeconomic divides. Some of the names you may recognize: the Admiral's wife, Mrs. Beardsley, Robert Small's wife, Ellen Murray of Penn Center, and Mrs. John McDonald, but there were many others. Women who worked repairing clothing would get double rations for their families, just like the men who built houses or dug ditches. In other words, remarkably, women got equal pay for their contributions to the recovery effort. By the end of the recovery effort, more than 20,000 garments had been distributed throughout the Lowcountry by these sewing circles. There were a lot of unsung heroes of the recovery effort. Barton singled out Hilton Head's Ben Green, a black man who placed his boat and services of himself and men at my disposal. For months, during good and bad weather, they brought over large amounts of supplies required for this district. Complaints from the mainland parts of the county grew loud in late spring 1894. The self-appointed Bluffton Relief Committee was particularly aggrieved against the Red Cross. They felt overlooked and discriminated against by the organization. Thomas Martin, a member of the committee, wrote the Palmetto Post about starvation among the white farmers in the area in late April, with additional letters decrying conditions continuing all the way through July. He sent letters to the News and Courier and to the state, taking umbrage in strong language to reports submitted by Clara Barton about conditions in his village and surrounding areas. The integrated Yamasee Relief Committee had similar complaints about lack of food aid coming from the Red Cross to relieve starvation in their area as well. Nevertheless, in late June 1894, Barton announced that help was no longer necessary. In her opinion, the aid provided, together with a revival of the phosphate industries, the fish in the rivers, and the boats in repair, have served to make the 30,000 Sea Islanders, whom we were asked to take charge of, 9 months ago, a prosperous and self-helping people. Almost 17,000, or approximately 50% of Beaufort County residents, had gotten help from the Red Cross during the 10-month recovery effort. All in all, Barton managed to feed 30,000 destitute people with only $30,000 in donated funds for a period of 10 months. As you have heard, the Red Cross was the lead relief agency, but it wasn't the only one. For example, Rachel Mather tapped into her religious and philanthropic circles and distributed food, clothing, tools, and occasionally a few coins to the endless stream of sufferers who came to Mather's school doors. But no good deed goes unpunished, and few people go all their lives without criticism. Mather collected the stories of survivors, some heard her earlier in this presentation, and published them in a booklet. The local newspaper editor wrote, "The $120 spent on publication of the storm-swept coast could have been better spent on actual relief." A week later, he ate crow. "We did an injustice with the lights now before us and hastened to remedy the evil. The book is to be sold." He goes on to say that Miss Mather pays a tribute to the Red Cross which many think it in no way deserves. Why, with an amount not over $10,000, Miss Mather did more real good work among the sufferers than the vaunted Red Cross with 4 times the amount. The Great Sea Island hurricane had great consequences for Beaufort County. There was a major loss of life, though the actual number of dead is unknown. Nevertheless, it remains the 5th most deadly hurricane in the United States almost 130 years later. The physical destruction to infrastructure had long-term economic impact, leading eventually to the destruction of phosphate mining in this area. At a time when the United States was absorbing vast numbers of immigrants with a population increase of 21% between 1890 and 1900, Beaufort County's population was at best stagnant. The county's population wouldn't reach 36,000 until the mid to late 1950s. The Red Cross went on to administer other hurricane relief efforts and adjusted its response according to lessons learned during its first hurricane relief effort here in 1893. The full story of the Great Sea Island storm may not ever be known. Joel Chandler Harris summed up his Scribner's article this way: "The impression left seems to be as vague and shapeless as the tempest was. There are those who know what was and who know what is. But between what was and what is lies the awful cataclysm of the storm, as all were caught by the storm and hurled into chaos. And when the morning dawned and the tide fell, and the sun shone serenely over the scene of wreck and devastation, there is none left to tell the definite story of the hurricane on the Sea Islands. There is none to tell it today."